The Trail of Tears stands as one of the darkest and most consequential forced migrations in American history. Driven by laws, broken treaties, and the belief that land should be taken for expansion, thousands of Native Americans were removed from their ancestral homelands and forced to walk into an uncertain future. In this video, we will listen to personal stories, unpack the political and legal choices that made removal possible, and trace the human cost of policies that ignored sovereignty and dignity. You will learn how displacement reshaped families and communities, how cultural loss and trauma carried across generations, and why these events still matter for our country today. Join me for a careful, respectful exploration of causes, experiences, and long-term consequences, so history is remembered honestly. If you want more thoughtfully told history, please subscribe. Hook. Thousands forced to leave their homes under military guard. During the 19th century, federal and state decisions combined to uproot whole native nations from lands they had tended for generations. Lawmakers pressed for new farms and new states, and state governments extended their reach into sovereign communities, passing statutes that stripped tribal governments of authority. The Supreme Court affirmed that many tribes retained a distinct political status, but that ruling did not stop the cascade of policies and pressures that led to forced removal. Economic incentives and settler demand added fuel to a machine already set in motion by political choices. Military detachments were used to carry out what these policies required. Troops and locally raised militias were ordered to gather communities, oversee roundups, and escort groups as they departed. Entire towns were sometimes held in encampments or stockades while removal was arranged. Commanders organized detachments into columns for the march westward, and many people left under the constant presence of armed guards. The practicalities of the operation, transport, provisioning, record-keeping, were managed by military officers, even as civilian officials negotiated treaties and allotments. The human consequences of that management were profound. Communities accustomed to farming and trading were forced into long overland journeys with inadequate shelter, erratic supplies, and outbreaks of disease. People of every age suffered, children, elders, and those in between, and many never reached their destination. One well-documented example is a nation whose population of approximately 16,000 was removed. Roughly 4,000 of its members died along the way or shortly after arrival. Those losses were not only statistical, they represented ruptured families, interrupted rights, and the loss of elders who had carried songs, stories, and governance knowledge forward. The longer arc of removal reshaped societies and landscapes. Ancestral homelands were transformed into new settlements and farms, and those who survived faced the challenge of rebuilding amid unfamiliar territory, disrupted economies, and weakened institutions. Cultural practices adapted or went underground, legal battles and claims persisted for generations, and patterns of displacement left enduring social and health disparities. Memory of the marches has become a central element of collective identity for many descendants, a somber reminder of what forced migration can do to communities over time. If this account mattered to you, consider subscribing for more respectful documentary narratives. One of the darkest chapters in American history. During the 19th century, federal policies aimed at expanding settler territory and asserting state control over indigenous lands set the stage for forced removals across the southeastern United States. Pressure from settlers hungry for farmland, combined with legislation that authorized the relocation of native nations, created a legal and political environment that prioritized expansion over treaty obligations. Test cases in the courts recognized aspects of tribal sovereignty, yet those decisions were not followed by effective federal enforcement, leaving native communities vulnerable to state and local actions that sought to dispossess them. Leaders and families who had built towns, schools, farms, and churches found themselves confronted with new mandates to leave their ancestral homelands. The Cherokee, Choctaw, Muskogee, Creek, Chickasaw, and Seminole nations, among others, faced removal under varying degrees of coercion. The Cherokee Nation pursued legal resistance, bringing a case that affirmed tribal rights in the highest court, but practical protection did not follow. As a result, forced marches and relocations unfolded under harsh conditions. Many people suffered from exposure, sickness, and a lack of adequate supplies. Estimates indicate that about 4,000 Cherokee died during their removal alone, and thousands more from other nations endured similar hardships. Children were orphaned, families were split, and entire communities were uprooted. The human effects went beyond immediate loss of life. Social structures and cultural systems were deeply disrupted, ceremonies and land-based practices were interrupted, and foodways tied to specific landscapes were lost or severely altered. Survivors had to adapt to unfamiliar and often inhospitable terrain, repeatedly rebuilding institutions in a context of poverty and displacement. Political consequences were long-lasting. Treaties were broken or rewritten, tribal governance was undermined, and the balance of power shifted decisively in favor of state and federal authorities seeking to settle and exploit new territories. Generational trauma and dispossession continue to shape Native communities today, even as many nations have preserved language, traditions, and governance despite enormous pressure. Memorials, museums, and educational efforts now strive to keep this history alive and to honor those who endured the removals. Contemporary legal and political struggles around sovereignty, land rights, and cultural preservation are part of that ongoing legacy. If this account resonates with you, please consider subscribing for more respectful historical narratives that illuminate difficult chapters and the resilience that follows. Native nations before removal. When European settlers and the expanding American Republic pushed into the southeastern lands, they encountered well-established native nations with complex political, economic, and social systems. The Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and Seminole maintained towns, farms, and trade routes that had been shaped over generations. Agriculture was sophisticated and diverse, centered on corn, beans, and squash, supplemented by hunting, fishing, and regional commerce. Kinship ties and clan systems structured social life. In many communities, descent and property responsibilities flowed through maternal lines, and councils of elders and chiefs settled disputes and coordinated communal affairs. Many nations combined tradition with selective adoption of new technologies and institutions. The Cherokee, for example, developed a syllabary that enabled widespread literacy, and they published a bilingual newspaper that circulated political debate and cultural expression across their towns. Some leaders drafted written constitutions and created republican-style councils to engage diplomatically with state and federal governments. Mission schools and Christian congregations were present in numerous communities, adopted by some families while others sustained traditional spiritual practices. These adaptations reflected strategic choices intended to protect homelands and assert sovereignty in the face of mounting pressure. Economic and social life was varied and dynamic. Trade extended from coastal markets to interior rivers, and many town centers served as hubs for artisans, farmers, and traders. At the same time, a small number of native households had incorporated European-style agriculture and slaveholding into their economic systems, a reality that added complexity to internal debates about identity and survival. Political divisions emerged between leaders who pursued accommodation, accepting some Euro-American forms of property and governance in hopes of coexistence, and those who resisted assimilation and fought to maintain customary lifeways. These internal strains were exploited by treaty negotiators and speculators, who often used coercion, deception, and state pressure to extract land. The consequences of that contact and the policies it produced were profound. Legal victories in federal courts affirmed the principle of tribal sovereignty, yet enforcement was uneven and often resisted by state authorities and settlers. As pressure for land intensified, treaties were coerced and social cohesion was weakened. Families and communities experienced dispossession, forced dispersal, and the fracturing of political authority. Long-term effects included loss of ancestral lands, disruption of cultural transmission, economic dislocation, and intergenerational trauma. Still, resilience endured. Nations preserved languages, ceremonies, and governance practices, and they continued to use legal and political channels to assert rights and rebuild institutions. If you found this perspective valuable, consider subscribing for more respectful historical narratives. Land hunger and the Indian Removal Act. When European settlers and American citizens pressed into the southeastern woodlands, the hunger for land became a driving force of policy and violence. Cotton had become king, and the soil of the Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole territories was prized for its fertility. Planters and speculators saw opportunity where indigenous people had lived for generations. State governments, local militias, and private interests pushed aggressively, while national politics provided a path to legalize removal. Economic motives intertwined with racial and cultural arguments to create a powerful case for dispossession. Congress passed legislation in 1830 that authorized the federal government to negotiate the transfer of indigenous nations from their ancestral homelands to lands west of the Mississippi. The law framed removal as voluntary negotiation, but its implementation relied heavily on coercion and imbalance of power. Federal funds were allocated to facilitate relocations, even as state laws and extralegal pressures made life increasingly untenable for tribal communities who refused to leave. The removal policy did not emerge in a vacuum. It was reinforced by local encroachment, legal maneuvering, and treaties obtained under dubious circumstances. Some tribes adopted elements of Euro-American governance and economy in hopes of coexistence and recognition. The Cherokee, for example, developed a written constitution and established schools and a newspaper, demonstrating adaptation without abandoning identity. Yet these adaptations did not prevent displacement. A shadow treaty signed by a small faction of Cherokee leaders, without the consent of the majority, was used as legal cover to enforce removal, deepening internal divisions and inflicting long-lasting political wounds. The Supreme Court affirmed tribal sovereignty in a key ruling, but the absence of sustained federal enforcement left that decision with little practical protection. The human cost was profound and enduring. Families were uprooted from farms, homes, and sacred sites. The process caused widespread illness, loss of livelihood, and deaths from exposure and disease during forced relocations. Many elders and children suffered most, and entire communities experienced cultural disruption that reverberated across generations. Loss of land meant not only the loss of economic resources but also severed spiritual and social ties to places central to identity and memory. The removal reshaped southeastern demographics and fueled further expansion of plantation slavery, altering the region's social fabric. Long-term consequences remain visible today. Dispossession produced cycles of poverty and legal battles over recognition and rights that continued for generations. Yet resilience persisted. Tribal nations rebuilt institutions, preserved languages, and maintained cultural practices despite displacement. Contemporary efforts for truth, preservation of historic sites, and educational initiatives seek to acknowledge these injustices and support healing. Understanding the causes and mechanisms, land hunger, political expediency, ambiguous legal protections, and economic greed, helps explain why forced migration unfolded and why its effects have endured. If this account was useful, please consider subscribing for more respectful historical narratives. Broken treaties and legal resistance. Treaties that were supposed to guarantee land, protection, and political autonomy were repeatedly undermined through coercion, manipulation, and outright refusal to honor agreed terms. Many native nations had entered into formal agreements with the United States that recognized their territorial boundaries and promised federal protection, but state governments moved to extend jurisdiction into those same territories, passing laws that conflicted with treaty language and asserting authority over people who had long governed themselves. One stark example was a treaty signed by a small group that did not represent the majority of a nation's leadership. Its ratification by Congress provided the legal pretext some officials used to justify forced removal, even as tribal leaders protested the treaty's legitimacy and sought every peaceful avenue of redress. Legal resistance became a central strategy for those seeking to defend their homes and rights. Tribal delegations carried petitions, legal briefs, and testimonies to the halls of power. In the high courts, challengers argued that state laws could not extend into territories occupied and governed by sovereign native nations, and that the federal government had a trust responsibility to uphold treaty commitments. One major court ruling acknowledged that states lacked authority to unilaterally impose their laws inside those territories, while another decision described the tribes in a way that recognized a unique political status and relationship with the federal government. Yet court rulings alone could not force compliance when political will was absent. Executive and state authorities often ignored judicial findings, and the absence of consistent enforcement turned legal victories into hollow protections for many communities. The human cost of broken promises and legal failures was profound and enduring. Removal severed families from ancestral lands, disrupted economies based on agriculture and trade, and shattered institutions such as schools, churches, and local governance structures that nations had built to sustain themselves. Long journeys taken under military escort exposed people to illness, hunger, and harsh weather. These hardships compounded grief and loss in ways that echoed for generations. Communities that had developed written constitutions, newspapers, and formal governments saw those civic achievements rendered vulnerable when treaties were disregarded, contributing to cultural dislocation and a legacy of trauma that persists. Long-term consequences extend into both law and daily life. The pattern of treaties being negotiated and later violated eroded trust in federal commitments and complicated later efforts to resolve land claims, restore rights, or repair relationships. In the legal arena, early court decisions created important precedents recognizing tribal sovereignty, but they also demonstrated that judicial protection depends on political enforcement. As a result, modern tribal advocacy draws on those precedents while also pushing for legislative remedies, negotiated settlements, and institutional reforms. The strategies used then, petitioning, litigation, diplomacy, and public testimony, remain part of contemporary efforts to preserve sovereignty, protect cultural sites, and seek restitution. If this history matters to you, please consider subscribing for more carefully narrated accounts of these struggles. Forced marches begin. When federal and state authorities began to enforce removal policies, Native communities were frequently rounded up and held in makeshift encampments before the journey west. The push that led to these removals grew from legislation, pressure for land, and treaties signed by small factions that did not represent the consensus of the peoples affected. The Treaty of New Echota, for example, had been signed by a minority and later became a principal legal justification used to compel the Cherokee from their homes. Federal troops and state militias established temporary forts and detention sites, Fort Cass among them, where families were forced to stay as plans for transport and march routes were finalized. Supplies were promised. They often arrived late or were insufficient. Men, women, and children were assembled and then moved in long columns across difficult terrain, with many forced to walk the entire route while some supplies were shipped by river or wagon. Disease spread quickly in crowded camps. Exposure to cold and rain, inadequate shelter, and contaminated food or water worsened health, and medical care was scant. Many elders and children could not keep pace. More than 4,000 Cherokee are estimated to have died during removal. Loss of life was not the only immediate toll. Separation, the confiscation of livestock and belongings, and the abrupt disruption of agricultural seasons compounded suffering. Leaders of removal expeditions argued they were acting under legal authority and following orders, but for those marched out the reality was a cascade of losses that reshaped families and communities. Entire towns were abandoned, crops ruined, and sacred sites left behind. Those intangible losses, of graves, of place names, of the daily rhythms of community life, cannot be fully quantified. In some instances, travel was organized into detachments with military escorts. In others, people set out on their own under duress and with little guidance. The variety of experiences did not lessen the shared trauma, and survivors carried memories of hunger, illness, and displacement across generations. The long-term consequences are profound and lasting. Tribes transplanted to what became known as Indian Territory had to rebuild political institutions and social networks, while mourning the dead and attempting to preserve language and cultural practices in alien surroundings. Judicial decisions that affirmed tribal rights, such as Worcester versus Georgia, left unresolved questions about enforcement and sovereignty that affected later legal and political struggles. Economic dislocation followed the removal, as access to traditional lands and livelihoods vanished and new systems of subsistence had to be established under difficult circumstances. Today, this history informs contemporary discussions about sovereignty, reparative justice, and the ways public memory is shaped. Memorials, educational programs, and tribal-led initiatives work to keep the stories alive and to honor those who suffered. If you find this careful account meaningful, please consider subscribing for more respectful historical narratives. Life on the trail, hunger, cold, disease. When government agents and state militias enforced removal orders, entire communities were rounded up and placed into makeshift encampments with far too little food, clothing, or shelter. Families that had lived for generations on the same land were suddenly crowded into pens, crude barracks, and riverbank assemblages while they awaited transport. The logistical system that was supposed to feed and equip these people broke down repeatedly. Contractors failed to deliver promised rations, wagons, and horses were scarce, and supply lines were routinely delayed or looted. As a result, hunger became an immediate and chronic condition for many marchers. Rations, when they arrived, were meager and often of poor quality. Cornmeal and salted pork were typical staples, but shipments were sometimes spoilage-prone, insufficient in quantity, or diverted before reaching the camps. People who had once cultivated diverse gardens and fields found themselves dependent on unfamiliar, monotonous food that did not meet nutritional needs. Children and the elderly suffered first from deficiency and weight loss. Malnutrition weakened immune systems and made ordinary infections far more dangerous. Anecdotal accounts and contemporary reports emphasize that families scavenged roots and berries, shared what little they had, and sometimes went days without adequate sustenance. Exposure to cold and inclement weather added another lethal dimension. Large detachments were marched across plains, mountain slopes, and river valleys during harsh weather, with inadequate clothing and few blankets. Many lacked shoes. Tents were often few, tarpaulins delayed, and fires could not be maintained for entire groups when fuel was scarce. People slept crowded together in wet clothes or under thin coverings. Hypothermia and respiratory illnesses followed. Some removal parties took water routes, and outbreaks aboard cramped riverboats or in temporary dockside camps proved devastating because close quarters accelerated the spread of disease. Disease moved through these communities swiftly and mercilessly. Dysentery and other diarrheal diseases were widespread due to contaminated water and poor sanitation. Cholera and typhus outbreaks occurred in overcrowded camps. Respiratory infections such as influenza and pneumonia claimed many lives, and smallpox and measles struck those without prior exposure or immunity. Medical care was minimal and often administered by poorly supplied army surgeons or volunteer physicians. The sick were frequently moved in wagons that became mobile wards, but those wagons were insufficient in number and poorly provisioned. Children, the very old, and those already weakened by hunger were most likely to die. For the Cherokee removal specifically, of the many thousands who were forced to move, an estimated 4,000 lost their lives to these combined hardships. The human toll was not only immediate. The deaths of elders and knowledge keepers eroded cultural continuity, and the loss of mothers and caregivers left children vulnerable and altered family structures irrevocably. Survivors carried long-term physical ailments from chronic malnutrition and untreated illness, and psychological trauma from the grief and displacement endured. Political and social leadership was disrupted as communities struggled to re-establish gardens, hunt in unfamiliar territory, and rebuild basic institutions under foreign administrative control. Written petitions, personal letters, and the records of tribal leaders document grief, protest, and a determination to preserve community despite staggering losses. Contemporary historians and tribal accounts emphasize the causes as much as the consequences. Forced removal policies, poor planning, corruption in supply contracts, and a lack of adequate medical and logistical support turned a coerced migration into a humanitarian calamity. The memory of hunger, cold, and disease on the march shapes how these events are remembered and taught today, and it underscores the long-term implications for health, cultural survival, and justice. For more respectful documentary accounts and further reading, please consider subscribing. Death, displacement, and survival. When federal policy mandated removal, entire societies were forced to leave lands their families had tended for generations. Native nations such as the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and Seminole were pushed from homelands through a combination of treaties that were often coerced or ignored, state aggression, and military enforcement. The legal battles many nations pursued barely altered the outcome, and removal was carried out with limited planning and inadequate resources. The result was mass displacement on a scale that destroyed familiar ways of life and placed communities in constant crisis. Death followed quickly for many who marched or were crowded into transport. Exposure, dysentery, smallpox, and starvation took lives, especially among elders and children who were least able to endure the hardships. For the Cherokee, the human cost is stark in the records. Estimates place the death toll at about 4,000 out of 16,000 people removed. Those numbers alone do not capture the depth of loss. Family networks were broken, caregivers vanished, and tribal social structures were strained almost to the point of collapse. Survivors described endless fatigue, the slow erosion of hope, and the overwhelming challenge of burying the dead without proper rites. Displacement produced long-term cultural consequences that went beyond immediate suffering. Sacred sites, cemeteries, and cultivated fields were abandoned, and with them went the material anchors of memory and tradition. Kinship-based economies were disrupted and languages and ceremonies were threatened when communities were scattered or forced to adapt to new environments and new political realities. Yet people found ways to survive. Some nations reconstituted councils and legal systems in their new territories. Literacy and communication tools already in use, like the Cherokee syllabary, helped preserve records, laws, and stories, enabling cultural transmission under extraordinary strain. Crafts, songs, and oral histories kept identity alive even while material wealth was diminished. The echoes of removal reach into the present day through health disparities, economic challenges, and ongoing struggles for recognition and rights. There are also visible efforts at remembrance and healing. Tribal governments rebuilt institutions, schools, and cultural programs. Federal and local initiatives now interpret removal routes and protect sites. Memorials and museum exhibits aim to teach subsequent generations. These acts of memory are part of survival too, transforming trauma into a continuing call for acknowledgement and justice. If this account resonates, consider subscribing for more careful, respectful historical narratives. Aftermath and permanent loss. The forced removals uprooted entire native nations from lands they had stewarded for generations, creating immediate and long-lasting dislocations of people, place, and governance. Legal maneuvers and contested treaties were used to justify the relocations. Even as some tribal nations won recognition of their sovereignty in the courts, those rulings were often ignored in practice. A notable example is the Cherokee capital at New Echota, whose contested treaty became the pretext for removal despite opposition from the majority of the Cherokee people. These actions did more than move populations. They severed the legal and social foundations that sustained communities. Families were fractured and communities traumatized. Many people who survived the journey arrived weak, sick, and bereft of possessions that had anchored daily life: homes, crops, tools, sacred bundles. Children lost parents. Elders lost the knowledge networks that had preserved language, ceremonies, and land management practices. The loss of burial grounds and sacred sites meant that grief could not always be expressed where ancestors lay. This created an intergenerational wound that shaped family structures and caregiving patterns for decades afterward. Economically, the consequences were profound and enduring. Displacement from long-cultivated fields and riverine resources erased established agricultural practices and market ties, forcing rapid and difficult adaptations to unfamiliar ecosystems. Later federal policies compounded these losses by further breaking up communal landholdings and opening territory to non-native settlement, accelerating dispossession. The erosion of a land base weakened political autonomy and made it harder for nations to sustain institutions, schools, and healthcare systems on terms they controlled. Cultural survival was tested but not extinguished. Languages, stories, and ceremonies were jeopardized by dispersion and policy pressures aimed at assimilation. At the same time, tribal resilience produced cultural revitalization movements, legal advocacy, and community rebuilding that persist today. Contemporary efforts include repatriation of ancestral remains and sacred objects under the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, federal recognition battles, and educational initiatives that reclaim history on tribal terms. Memorials, museums, and the Trail of Tears National Historic Trail function as places of remembrance and learning, keeping memory alive while reframing public understanding. The aftermath of forced removal remains present in political and social life. Ongoing legal claims, land restitution efforts, and sovereignty assertions reflect long-term attempts to repair harm and restore self-determination. Healing work addresses both material restitution and the less visible needs for cultural continuity and mental health across generations. Many tribal governments now run language immersion programs, cultural centers, and economic development projects to rebuild what was lost and to fortify future generations. If you found this summary valuable, please consider subscribing for more historical insights. Why the Trail of Tears still defines America. Federal removal policy was not an isolated administrative decision but the culmination of legal, political, and economic forces that prioritized expansion over treaty obligations and human dignity. Courts affirmed tribal sovereignty, while other branches of government and private interests pushed a conflicting agenda. Treaties were signed under duress or by small, unrepresentative factions, and those agreements were then used to justify mass expulsions. The Cherokee legal resistance is a concrete example. They sought protection through the courts and won important rulings recognizing tribal autonomy, yet those decisions were not translated into relief on the ground. That dissonance between law and enforcement reveals how the removal era established a pattern in which legal protections for Indigenous peoples could be rendered hollow by political will. The human cost is central to why this episode continues to define the nation. Families uprooted from ancestral towns lost not only property but the relational and spiritual connections to place that sustained cultures for generations. Many who were forced to march endured exposure, disease, and deprivation. Survivors carried the trauma forward, shaping community memory and identity. Oral histories and tribal archives preserve individual stories of endurance and loss, and they remind us that the consequences were measured in lives interrupted and traditions imperiled, not merely in acres transferred on a map. Long-term consequences are visible in law, economy, and culture. The removal set precedents for later federal Indian policy, embedding a pattern of displacement, assimilation pressures, and broken promises that would resurface in the form of allotment, boarding schools, and persistent land disputes. Economically, the seizure of fertile lands and natural resources facilitated settler wealth and state development, creating disparities that persist. Indigenous nations were deprived of the economic base that underpinned communal autonomy. Culturally, language suppression and forced acculturation threatened continuity, even as communities worked to preserve and revive traditions, ceremonies, and governance structures. Memory and reconciliation remain uneven but active. Memorials, designated historic trails, and educational initiatives seek to make the full story visible to new generations. Tribal nations continue legal and political struggles to protect sovereignty, natural resources, and cultural heritage, while also expanding language revitalization programs, museums, and schools that center Native perspectives. At the same time, National narratives about progress and expansion are being re-examined. Museums, educators, and policymakers increasingly acknowledge that the prosperity many celebrate was built in part on dispossession. The Trail of Tears endures as a defining chapter because it crystallizes fundamental tensions in the American project: competing claims of law versus power, expansion versus justice, and economic growth versus human rights. Its legacy informs contemporary debates about land, reparations, and federal responsibilities. In remembering both the causes and the resilience that followed, the nation is forced to confront uncomfortable truths and to consider what justice might require going forward. If you value careful, respectful history like this, consider subscribing for more documentary narration and context. We close with the truth that the Trail of Tears was not an isolated tragedy but the result of expansionist policies, broken treaties, and laws that forced indigenous nations from their ancestral lands. The forced marches, the loss of homes, and the separation of families caused deep and lasting human suffering, reshaping lives and cultures for generations. The consequences still ripple today in land dispossession, legal battles over sovereignty, and the ongoing work of remembrance and cultural survival. As you leave this story, carry with you compassion for those who endured and a commitment to learning the fuller history behind our maps and monuments. If this resonated with you, consider subscribing for more thoughtful explorations of history and its living effects. In upcoming episodes, we will examine other policies of removal, the resilience of Indigenous communities, and how history informs our present choices. Thank you for listening and remembering with us.